was Israel really trying to bring Iran into the conflict
I mean,
through
it
Gaza?
definitely. So, since the beginning of the conflict in Gaza, since we have the war, the October 7 attacks on Israeli civilians, and then the Israeli attacks on Gaza, um, there has been a worry. This is a worry in Washington, it's a worry in the region, it's a worry in Iran, it's a worry in Israel, that Iran and Israel will come to a direct conflict. That would be a huge sort of conflagration that will involve everybody. And I can tell you that neither Iran nor Israel has really wanted that, right? Because they know that it can be very costly. But it does appear at times that there are certain elements in Iran and certain elements in Israel that don't necessarily mind it.
So, welcome everyone to this podcast of Middle East Insights platform. And today, for this online talk, which is between Iran and Israel conflict and the ramifications for it, we have a very special guest, Arash Azizi, with us to talk about the nuances. And along with that, I also have his new book that you should buy. And it's very interesting and it's available on Amazon India. And the fact is that this topic is very interesting because a couple of developments have taken place in the past few days. For example, yesterday the Houthis fired a hypersonic missile in central Israel, and God knows what happened to the Iron Dome. Then the Houthis and Hamas officials are also opening their offices in Iraq, supposedly. Houthis are also getting involved to fight in the Palestinian war. Meanwhile, Israel is allegedly recruiting Africans and those who are seeking asylum to fight on the Gaza front. At the same time, there are reports that Israel itself killed three of the hostages by mistake. So, in this entire context of so much of fluidity and so much of post truth hyper reality, where we don't really understand what's the truth sitting from the corners of our home, we are very privileged to have Arash Azizi with us. So, a bit about him. He writes for the Atlantic. He's a historian and author of The Shadow Commander, Soleimani, the US, and Iran's Global Ambitions. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, Newsline Magazine, Toronto Star, Jacobin, and several of the book length translations have been published in Iran. Currently, he lives in New York. So, with this, sir, we are very, very thankful to have the privilege of your time. And the floor is all yours now.
Well, my privilege is to be with you. I'm very glad that we're going to have this conversation. So, and let me start by saying that you sort of said this thing about the post-truth and things are not always clear from the Middle East, and especially I understand. I mean, India is not that far from the Middle East, but it's not as directly involved, obviously, in the war. And interestingly, even the U.S. is a lot harder. Sorry, is a lot farther. But the domestic U.S. politics, it really involves the Israeli-Palestinian conflict much more than India, as far as I know. I mean, there's a bit of it in India, but not as much. So let me offer a view of what's really happening in our region and what is this conflict really about. Because of course, it's a conflict that could involve India, could involve the entire world, and it's a danger to the entire world in many ways. Now. Um, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, has gone on for a very long time. And the basis of this conflict is pretty simple. It is not primarily a religious conflict. It is an ethno-national conflict. It's a conflict of two national groupings, that is the Israeli Jews and the Palestinian Arabs, who are having a conflict over relatively a small piece of land, which was a British mandate until 1947, just like India, actually, at the same time where Britain decided to partition British India into India and what became Pakistan and later Bangladesh. At the same time, the UN decided, British Britain said it doesn't want to have anything to do with what was at the time called British Mandate Palestine. He said it doesn't want to have anything to do with it anyway, passed it to the United Nations. The United Nations, with the majority of its membership in the General Assembly at the time, decided to partition British Mandate Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, I don't want to go into all of that history, although if it came up in the talk, I'll be happy to address. I'm a historian, so I like talking about history. I'm happy to sort of address that. But the point is that so this division that happened in 47 was never really accepted by the Palestinian Arab side, which did not want to give up what it considered to be half of its homeland, right? It considered all of that to be its homeland. Um, and historically, it hasn't really been even accepted by the Israeli Jewish side. Even though in 1947 they found the state of Israel in May 1948, they declared the foundation of the state of Israel. And they immediately engage in a war, and the borders that of the state of Israel are initially determined by the results of that war, not what the UN had given. So Israel gets more in that war. But they never come to a full agreement as to, okay, you're here, we are here. The way that India and Pakistan mostly have, except for of course there are territorial issues around Kashmir and others, but they mostly have. But in Israel Palestine, this never really happens, and this is very consequential because in 1967. In this, what is known as a Six-Day War, Israel goes to war with Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and Israel takes over the West Bank and Gaza. These are parts that were controlled respectively by Jordan and Egypt after 1948, and now Israel takes them over. So since 1967, we have this terrible reality, which is that millions of Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza live under the Israeli occupation. There are very few people in the world who live under a similar occupation. You can argue that pretty much no other population really lives under this occupation. Maybe the Rohingya in Myanmar are similar. There are, of course, populations where people don't really receive citizenship, or some parts of the people don't. But here, what we have is a situation in which millions of Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza. They are nominally citizens of the state of Palestine, so they don't usually show up in a list of stateless people. They have a Palestinian passport, but their lives are not controlled by the state of Palestine, which for all intents and purposes exists mostly diplomatically as a diplomatic reality, and not as a state, on the ground. And their lives are controlled by Israel. So that's a root of the problem, if you will. It's a root of the problem. There's millions of people that are striving for self-determination. They know nobody wants to live under this military occupation, and of course, so this becomes the core of this, what I call an ethno-national conflict, the ethno-national conflict between the state of Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. And Israel has the upper hand, which is why it has been able to occupy and rule over these people for so very long. Now, traditionally, so we have Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You're with me, right? We have Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's a conflict. I'm not talking about Egypt or Syria or other states. They've sometimes inserted themselves into this conflict, but it's a separate issue. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is within the small confines between the river and the sea, right? Between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. We historically had another bigger set of conflict called the Israeli-Arab conflict. This was the conflict of Israel with Arab countries, that we are talking about hundreds of millions of people gathered in states like Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, now Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Libya, Sudan, Morocco. The Arab world is massive, right? And these states as a whole, they had a conflict with Israel. Iran, as you know, is not an Arab state. It is a state next to the Arab world. It's a neighbor of Iraq, so they if we go, as you know, from India to Pakistan, and then next door is Iran, and then next door is Iraq. So Iran was not part of this Arab Israeli Arab conflict, and the Israeli Arab conflict was one in which the Arab states fought on behalf of the Palestinians, and also at some point they really wanted to destroy Israel. They believed that Israel was a colonial imposition. They believed that it didn't belong in the Middle East. They wanted to get rid of it, and that's why they went to these wars. But they lost in 48, they lost in 1967, they lost in 1973 in a very important war, the Yom Kippur War of 73, in which Israel got hurt a lot, but it effectively won. You wouldn't know that if you travel to Egypt, because there are all signs about the glorious victories in the what they call the Harb October, or the October War. But Israel effectively won that war too. As a result of all of that, the Israeli-Arab conflict came to an end. The most important sign of it coming to an end was started in 1977, where Anwar Sadat, then president of Egypt, went to Jerusalem, spoke in the Israeli parliament, and said that Egypt had no problem with Israel. They made peace, as you know, under the aegis of President Carter of the United States. They signed the Camp David Accords of 1978. Egypt and Israel signed the peace treaty in 1979. And effectively, since then, no Arab country has really fought Israel. It's a very important fact that we forget. Since 1979, I imagine nobody, most of your students weren't born, even some of the parents were kids. Since then, Israel has not fought with Arab countries. The Arab countries made it clear after a while that they'll be happy to recognize Israel. In 2002, in the Arab League summit in Beirut, led by the Saudi Arabia, Arab League, which is a league of all Arab states, that includes 22 Arab states, includes all of the states I mentioned, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, every Arab state. They offered Israel what they call the Arab Peace Initiative, in which they said, if Israel ends the occupation of the Palestinian territories, and allows the formation of the Palestinian state, they'll be happy to recognize Israel. Now that hasn't happened, but they haven't fought. Even though that hasn't happened, they've never haven't fought. These Arab militaries have not taken action against Israel. So the Arab-Palestinian conflict is going on. Arab-Israeli conflict has been dormant. Now there is a new fact of life since 1979, which is the Israeli-Iranian conflict. Now, in 1979, just when Egypt had accepted Israel and signed the peace treaty, there was a revolution in Iran, as you know. This revolution changed the government of Iran to an Islamist government. And this was an Islamist leftist government at the beginning, because it wasn't really a leftist government, but the left had supported it. But on a broad basis, it was anti-Israel. They were very critical of the Shah's regime for his relations with Israel, and Iran cut relations with Israel. One of the first thing it did is they cut its relations with Israel. It stopped selling oil to Israel, and South Africa, actually, at the time, which was an apartheid regime. But at any rate, the ties between Iran and Israel, and I see that I'm coming toward the end of my 10 minutes, so I speak a couple more minutes, and then we can take it there. So Iran has now a government that declares the enmity to Israel as a core value of itself. Now, this is just words at the beginning. Iran, the Islamic Republic, enters into a war almost immediately after its formation, because it's attacked, but it's not attacked by Israel. It's actually attacked by Israel's biggest enemy, which was Iraq, under the presidency of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, who had become president in 1979 himself, attacks Iran in 1980. Iran enters a long war with Iraq, the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. In this war, actually, not only Israel is not fighting with Iran, Israel is helping Iran. Israel helps Iran in this war. It helps Iran by giving it military aid through the United States, and by attacking the Iraqi nuclear reactors. In 1981, it destroys Osirak, which is the Iraqi nuclear reactors, which obviously is sort of seen as a big help to Iran. But at the same time, Iran, the Iranian foreign policy, we could talk about it forever. It's a very sort of complex thing. But one of the key things that Iran starts funding these militias that are revolutionary militias that are supposed to advance its ideology. and what these militias have in common is that they're really anti-Israel. Most importantly, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Iran uses the historical links between the Shia, that's the denomination of Islam, as you know, the Shia of southern Lebanon, with Iran. It uses them to build this new group called Hezbollah, which wants to fight Israel. Of course, this finds a special meaning because Israel ends up occupying Lebanon from 1981 to 2000. Israel occupies southern Lebanon from 1981 to 2000 as part of its fights against the Palestinians, because the Palestinians were based in southern Lebanon. I know Middle East politics can be complicated, but I'm happy to explain anything more. So the Palestinians are based in 1981. Israel drives them out. It occupies southern Lebanon. It's part of what is going on, which is a civil war in Lebanon at the time. But at any rate, as a result, you have overall in time, you're going to have a Hezbollah-Israel conflict, which is effectively a shadow conflict between Iran and Israel. So we had Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is still going on, Israeli-Arab conflict that is dormant, as we said. It hasn't really gone on, although it doesn't mean that it's entirely finished because there are a lot of sentiments, but effectively it's over. But now you get an Israeli-Iranian shadow conflict. Shadow part is important because Israel and Iran don't attack each other directly, but they indirectly do. Iran through its sponsorship of Hezbollah, and Israel through covert actions that it takes against the nuclear program in Iran. Now, this year, 2024, for the first time, the shadow conflict between Iran and Israel became a real conflict because in April, Iran attacked Israeli soil directly in response to an Israeli assassination of an Iranian military official who was in a consular building of Iran in Damascus. So because Israel attacked an Iranian consular building in Damascus, Syria, i.e. attacked Iranian diplomatic territory directly, Iran saw to itself that it has to respond directly. It responded directly, and there has been a back and forth since then that has put our region in much danger, because of course a direct military confrontation between Iran and Israel can be very dangerous. It can involve a lot of people. You notice that I didn't really talk about the Gaza war. I didn't really talk about October 7 and all that. And that's because while that war is very important, we can talk about it. It's really this broader context that really matters. And the broader context is one of the fact that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like a sword that is going on. The Israeli-Arab conflict is dormant, but has not been solved in fundamental way. Most Arab states still don't recognize Israel. They don't have relations with Israel. And even in countries that do recognize Israel, like Egypt, like Jordan, like United Arab Emirates, like Morocco, a lot of popular sentiments are on the Palestinian side, certainly. And that there's an active Iranian-Israeli conflict now, whose first big sign in the shadow of it was 2006 when Hezbollah and Israel had a war for about 2 months. That was a very devastating war, but which entered the direct phase since April as well. So any attempt to bring peace to the region must take into account these three conflicts that I mentioned, and talk about how they can wind down.
Thank you so much, sir, for simplifying decades of history in such a short period of of time. And all the students are now requested to ask their questions in the chat box. My first question to you, sir, is that why the shadow war is going on as a performance? For example, in April, Iran already told Switzerland, Turkey, and other countries that it's going to attack Israel as a retaliation. Then, after the death of or the murder of Ismail Hania, Fuad Shukr, US and the West have been trying to create a prophecy that Iran is going to attack today, Iran is going to attack tomorrow. Every day it was like a certain kind of inkling that the attack is going to come. At the same time, there has been no attack so far of that degree. But this anti-Iranian paradigm, and you live in US, you must be experiencing it through the news outlets and the 50 days left for the elections on an everyday basis. So this kind of anti-Iranian paradigm has been advertised and capitalized on, leaving the Gaza genocide aside. So my question to you, in simple words, is that was Israel really trying to bring Iran into the conflict
I mean,
through
it
Gaza?
definitely. So since the beginning of the conflict in Gaza, since we have the war, the October 7 attacks on Israeli civilians and then the Israeli attacks on Gaza, um, there has been a worry. This is a worry in Washington, it's a worry in the region, it's a worry in Iran, it's a worry in Israel, that Iran and Israel will come to a direct conflict. That would be a huge sort of conflagration that will involve everybody. And I can tell you that neither Iran nor Israel has really wanted that, right? Because they know that it can be very costly. But it does appear at times that there are certain elements in Iran and certain elements in Israel that don't necessarily mind it. There are certain elements in Iran that believe, look, we have to go to a final fight with Israel. We have to fight for Palestinians. Palestinian people are getting killed. We're silent. We're doing nothing. And Israel has operated on Iranian territory. Israel has operated on Iranian territory repeatedly in recent years, by the way. It killed Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, Iranian chief nuclear official in 2020. Before that, in 2018, it stole Iranian's nuclear archives. It has repeatedly sort of arrested people on the Iranian territory. And as you mentioned, it killed Ismail Haniyeh, leader of Hamas in Iran, a couple months ago. So there are sides in Iran who say this should happen. And in Israel, it sometimes appears that if Benjamin Netanyahu, the controversial prime minister of Israel, he wants to get into conflict with Iran to save his very flailing political fortune and to bring United States into a war with Iran. The idea is that if Israel enters the war with Iran, United States will have to act. Certainly under President Biden, who's a very strong supporter of Israel, but even under whoever the next president is. So obviously, if it's Trump or it's Kamala Harris, there will be very different calculations. But it's for both of them, there would be a real chance of United States getting involved. And Israel would love to have the big bully superpower come fight Iran for it. Potentially. I mean, at least we could see how some people in Israel would love that. But there are many others in Israel. I believe most people in the Israeli military establishment, security establishment, they're not very happy about the possibility of a direct war with Iran. Because they know it can be very devastating. They know Israel is not ready for it. It's not ready for it socially. It's not ready for it sort of militarily either, really. So, but nevertheless, there are elements in both countries that might push toward that, but there are many more elements that also don't want that. So that's really the answer. And yeah, Netanyahu, as I said, sometimes appears to be pushing it too much. Otherwise, why would you kill Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran? Um, and as for why there's a lot of talk and no action, basically, well, it's because it's easier to talk about attacking Israel than doing it, right? So Iran, yes, in April it did a big dance and show and it did all these attacks, but no one got hurt in Israel. I believe one young Arab girl unfortunately died, but that's pretty much the only casualty. And there's always a war of narratives. Like, did Iran really did this on purpose? Did it not want to hurt anyone, wanted to just send a warning, or did it try, but the defense was so good, that was prevented from doing what it wanted to do? My theory is mostly the former. I believe Iran did not want, to cause a lot of damage, but also even if it wants to cause a lot of damage, it has limited capabilities. So I think what has happened in the last couple of months, since Haniyeh was killed, is that a lot of people in Iran warned the leadership in Tehran, said, don't get into a conflict with Israel. It's not in the interest of Iran. Um, but also Iran assesses military capabilities and see they're limited in how much it can attack Israel. So that really explains where we are. But the danger has not, the danger is still there. The danger is very much still there. But Iran does have it's important to remember there's been a change in leadership in Iran. Now, the leadership in Iran, it rests with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He's the one who calls all the shots. He's the one who decides. Um, but there are, nevertheless, many different political factions in the Islamic Republic in Iran. And who comes on top has a huge consequences for what kind of policies Iran is going to have. And for the last little while, um, they, as you know, Iranians elected Masoud Pezeshkian, a reformist, to their presidency, and in the second round of presidential elections, two very stark choices were in front of Iranians. It was Masoud Pezeshkian, a reformist, and Saeed Jalili, a hardliner. Iranians picked Masoud Pezeshkian, who very much ran on the possibility of peace with the world, of lifting the sanctions that have crippled the Iranian economy. Um, so people like Pezeshkian will also not be interested in getting the country into a war. That's the last thing they want. What they want is a economic development, lifting of the restrictions that are on Iran. Of course, it's easier said than done. Iran continues to have very important conflicts with both Europe and the West and the United States. Not only Iran's nuclear program, which is subjected to a lot of sanctions, is also Iran's support for these militias like the Houthis that you mentioned earlier, like the Iraqi Shia militias like Hezbollah. And Iran's support for Russia, military support for Russia against the war in Ukraine, a lot of which Iran denies, but nevertheless, a lot of which has been confirmed to be true by the West, by the Europeans and the United States, which has led to new sanctions and a new source of tension between Iran and the West. So that's where we find ourselves in. That there are important elements in Iran, including those around Masoud Pezeshkian, like Javad Zarif, former foreign minister, who is now the vice president for strategic affairs, and Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, who used to be deputy foreign minister under Zarif, is back as the foreign minister. These are people who had a long history of negotiating with the United States and reaching a nuclear agreement in 2015, which was later quitted by Trump in 2018. So there will be an attempt in Iran to try to bring some sort of a deal and lessen the pressure on the country. We're going to have to see its details, but there's definitely a push for better relations with the world on part of Tehran. You're muted.
That is also true when we talk about media narratives and how media is trying to create this, shadow war into a direct war and trying to predict. And yesterday, something very interesting happened. A columnist like Jonathan Fredland, David Aronovich, David Badiel, Hadley Freeman, four columnists who had been writing and their parents also for Jewish Chronicle for almost like 70 years and others. They quit Jewish Chronicle, which is one of the oldest Jewish newspaper in United Kingdom.
It's the oldest in the world, actually.
Yeah. And what Ellen Perry was basically a ex-IDF soldier was writing about some kind of so-called now fabrications on Hamas and the workings of Hamas. But there's one question that I want to ask you, and I come from a place of ignorance, actually two questions. What happened to Ibrahim Raisi?
Well, well, look, Ibrahim Raisi died in a helicopter crash. Now, is it possible that it was foul play? I don't know. You tell me what happened to Subhash Chandra Bose, when his plane went down. It's you never know with the with incidents like this. Whenever someone important dies in a military in a crash like that, you have suspicions of foul play. Maybe years from now, documents will surface and people will know. But I can tell you this, the death of Ibrahim Raisi in the helicopter crash led to an important change in Tehran. So they could have held small elections and elected someone similar, but they didn't do that. They passed the power on to a different faction of the Islamic Republic. So it shows that the election was the crash was certainly of significance, and it favored some people over the others, as I wrote, and it has led to a shift in power in Tehran, be it a subtle shift.
So one other thing which I don't understand is like the International Atomic Energy Agency and others are all hell-bent. The West is hell-bent about what kind of nuclear development Iran is doing, and so many checks and measures are incorporated. But Israel somehow has nuclear opacity. What does it mean? Like, what is the term nuclear opacity and nuclear
Nuclear opacity
non-proliferation?
just means Israel doesn't openly declare that it has nuclear weapons, but everyone knows that Israel has nuclear weapons. I mean, Israel is not a member of NPT and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it has nuclear weapons. So, I mean, everyone knows there are 9 nuclear countries in the world. The United States, France, China, Russia, Britain, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. So, yes, Israel has nuclear weapons. There is no doubt about that.
Yeah. Now, my next
They just
question
don't
is,
openly declare it.
yeah, I never understand why this kind of asymmetry is there, because the term that is used for Israel is nuclear opacity. And I'm like, what is this?
Oh, you mean why by what do you mean by asymmetry? You mean why does the West not mind that Israel has nuclear weapons?
Yes, we were
Well,
sanctioned.
well, as in India was sanctioned?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah, well, Israel doesn't openly declare it, and it has good relations with the West, so it gets away with it. That's right. I mean, and it's not a member of NPT, interestingly enough. So technically, it's not violating its obligations to the NPT. But yeah, the international society has never worked in sort of based on uniform laws that are for everyone. Yeah, I don't know what's the sort of history of sanctions in India and what happened to them ultimately, but obviously India does not have sanctions on it now, does it? And
No, no,
it
it
has nuclear
doesn't.
weapons.
But there is this entire theory that Homi Bhabha, who was one of our greatest scientists, was assassinated by CIA.
Ah, all
So
right.
that is something which is there in the discourse. I don't know how true it is. Coming to the next question by a volunteer, Gorang Salkar, and Gorang has two questions. The first question is: writers like you have often discussed socialism and Cold War dynamics, including those shaping in the Middle East. Terms like
Mhm.
Israeli imperialism still appear today. Comparing current tensions with the Cold War, what are the key similarities and differences?
That's an excellent question. I'll be very happy to respond. I see there are also some questions in chat. So I'll
Yeah.
answer Gorang, and then we can go to questions in the chat. So Gorang, yes, I'm a Cold War scholar. I love the Cold War. These books behind me, a lot of them are about the Cold War. So, I think about this question a lot. I think the biggest difference is that in the Cold War, you had um, there was a global contest. The key question to which was, it wasn't actually whether India will be bigger than Pakistan, or it was the future of humanity. Is it going to be capitalist or is it going to be communist? There was a genuine contest in the world everywhere about you know what kind of civilization should we have, communist or capitalist, or two different visions of modernity. And this animated politics everywhere in the world. As you know, the communist parties in India had tens of millions of members. So there were hundreds of millions of Indians who took the side, if you will, of the communist movement in this global conflict between communism and capitalism. And there were hundreds of millions who didn't. Um, so this was very important, and this was really what animated politics at the time, and it was the same everywhere in the world, right? So you name the country, I'll tell you, right? There was no country in which you didn't have this contest. Almost, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but almost. There were communist parties pretty much everywhere in the world. No, this doesn't mean um that the national conflicts disappeared, that geopolitical conflicts disappeared. They didn't. They had to conform to this mode of Cold War. So if you look in India, for example, as you know, in 1964, the Communist Party of India had a very important split. That's how we have the Communist Party of India Marxist as opposed to the Communist Party of India. First, it was CPI right, CPI left. It becomes sort of the CPM and CPI. And there are different questions, different important questions on this. What should be our attitude to China? What should be which was also communist, but came into conflict with the Soviet Union, right? So by 1964, China was already fighting the Soviet Union effectively, not in militarily, but ideologically. What should Indian communist position be? What should the relationship to the Indian Congress, Indian National Congress be? Which meant, the big question was, what kind of attitude should they have to Indian national interest and all that. So these questions were always there, and they divided the communist movement. But nevertheless, there was a broad global conflict between communism and capitalism, which animated politics everywhere. We do not have that anymore, right? So now we can talk about there is a geopolitical conflict between India and China and United States and Pakistan, and we can talk about all of that, but there is not the same sort of an animating global ideological contest. Some people, for example, want to say there's one between democracy and autocracy, but I don't really think so. India is obviously a democratic country, but it's allied with the West. But its foreign policy is not about democracy, really, or you don't really have the masses of people being involved in a, for good or worse, in a sort of a global conflict about democracy versus autocracy. To a limited degree, you sometimes have. To a limited degree, you sometimes have. So let's say India, as you know, is allied with Australia and Japan and the United States in the Quad, which is supposed to sort of be countering China. But at the same time, India is also allied with Israel and United Arab Emirates. And Emirates is certainly not democratic. Israel is questionably democratic, but it's allied with them. In what is it, U2I2? So you don't really have that. So that's why I don't think when people say, is there a new Cold War? My answer is no. What it is what it's as your foreign minister, also Subramaniam Janishkar has sometimes said, what we really have is a multipolar world, right? We're entering the world in which countries, each of which are entering, um, into geopolitical conflict in terms of their own interests, and you don't have the same sort of global ideological contest. That determines everything. That's why Iran is kind of a weird player, because it still has a strong ideological element to much of its foreign policy making, and to the much of the way which it justifies itself. But that's not really happening anywhere else, right? The states mostly are there for sort of their own geopolitical interests. So that's the most important difference between Cold War and now. That's why I don't think we are living in a new Cold War. So should I go answer the questions in the chat?
I want to tell you about one aspect because we talked about communist parties.
Uh-huh.
So we recently, on 12th of September, just 4 days back, we lost Sitaram Yechury, who was
Right.
the General Secretary of Communist Party of India, Marxist. And he lives on in spite of his death because he has donated his own whole body to All India Medical Sciences aims for research. And it is a big loss for
Very sad event. Yeah, it was a very
us.
sad event. I noted it on my sort of social media. I did send condolences to the party, and to the people of India. Yes, it was sad. Comrade Sitaram he had a very long history of activity in the communist movement, and also for historians like me, when you see the passing of figures, you almost see the passing of time, and there's something definitely sad about that. But I looked at I'm sure we can make many criticisms also of the Indian communists. But one thing that is inspiring to me is how they've been able to build broad coalitions often, and also hold power, and be democratically elected in Kerala, in West Bank, and not anymore in West Bank, but historically, and Tripura previously also, and in Bihar, in little towns. They've shown that they've shown how communists can operate in a democratic system, and that has always been a sort of point of inspiration for the rest of us.
I feel like I'm talking with an Indian actually, with the kind of, command over all the state names and the terminologies, linguistics. I don't feel as if I'm talking with someone who is living in New York and is of a different lineage. But thank you so much for that. Gorang's next question is, since you have also written about Soleimani,
Mhm.
with the ongoing political and military assassinations, is Iran being hesitant to retaliate and reciprocate? Though we have touched this, but do you think that the newly elected president, Pezeshkian, uh, will have any role? Uh, because Trump is going to come again.
Well,
most
I'm not sure
probably.
Trump will. I don't think it's most probably at this point. I certainly hope not, and I mean I don't think it's very likely at this point. I mean it's a possibility, unfortunately, but I don't think he will come back. Now, to answer the question directly, um, Iran, as I already sort of touched it, as you said, Iran finds itself limited in what it can do to retaliate because it doesn't want to get itself in a broader war. It sees that as walking into a trap set by Netanyahu. It doesn't want to get itself into a broader war. Um, and also has the limited capacities, right? What can it do really against Israel? It's easy to say, but what will it specifically do? With Soleimani, they said we're gonna do a harsh. What harsh revenge can they do? Can they assassinate a leading, let's say Iran declared CENTCOM, the US CENTCOM, a terrorist organization. Great. But can they go and like kill the leader of CENTCOM and not expect a huge retaliation? It's not what they're interested in. And they don't have the capacities. So there's both the worry of what will come, but even if they want it tomorrow morning, decide they want to do it, it's easier said than done. As for your question of Pezeshkian, yes, look, Pezeshkian has limited power. As I said, the real power rests with the Supreme Leader Khamenei, but Pezeshkian's coming to presidency does mean that more of the reformist and centrist factions in Iran are in the important political influence in Iran. And Khamenei is 85. He's going to die at some point, which will also lead to shift in Iranian policy. So the short answer is yes, there is a tendency in Tehran to want to lower the tensions, and for Iran to be able to economically develop, to have a more calm neighborhood and all that. And even if it's Trump, they'll try to come to the deal with the United States. Certainly if it's Kamala Harris, but even if it's Trump, they'll try to come to a deal with the United States.
Since we're talking about death, Trump has trumped death for the second time yesterday. 3 months, 2 assassination attempts. And that is going to work very well for the PR.
I'm not sure the details of these attempts yesterday are not clear.
Yeah.
Obviously, we should all condemn all political violence. Its democratic means should be used to determine who's going to be in the White House or any other position in the United States. But anyways, we can talk about American politics if you want. But I mean, I don't think Trump has a high chance of winning at this point. I think
Okay. We
he's
will talk
polling at
on 5th November.
yes,
We'll talk on 5th November. So the next question is from Anurag Kond. He's a member of MEI, and his question is that what role do you see or envision India playing in any kind of, this paradigm of Israel shadow war? Given New Delhi's amicable ties with Tehran and Tel Aviv to a certain extent?
Yeah. This is an excellent question, Anurag. This is an excellent question. Look, India can play an important role. And as you said, this is very important. This is how diplomacy works. Where do you have countries which have good ties with both sides? And yes, India traditionally has great ties with Iran. It has now increasingly good ties with Israel. I hope that it can use it. I hope that it can use it as a go-between, as a mediator, as you know, as a country that can help de-escalate. What we need is a de-escalation of tensions in the region. So India can. Now, whether historically has India done anything like this? Not really, right? So India has not really, as far as I know, and I'm doing now some research actually on 1970s and the way Iran was involved in the war with India and Pakistan and in the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971. So there's all sorts of interesting historical evidence there, but India has not really come to play, let's say, a mediatory role. But I think India can also play a good mediatory role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Frankly, India also has relatively good relations with Palestine. Now, of course, Prime Minister Modi is well known for his sort of chum's relation with Netanyahu and all that. But India also has a proud tradition of non-alignment in foreign policy. I personally think Iran should learn from the Indian tradition of non-alignment. I think this is also fits very well this multipolar world that is coming. I think countries should not form permanent blocks, but they should sort of be non-aligned and try to have good relations with everybody. So I think we can learn from that. And yes, I think India can play a role. India, as I said, also, for example, that has relations with Israel and United Arab Emirates, right, in the I2U2, and it has good relations with the United States now, which it didn't for a very long time. Um, I'm old enough to remember when uh, the I guess the communist MPs voted down the government of Manmohan Singh because of the nuclear pact that it had with the United States. I reported on it. That's ages you. I remember being old enough to report on this at the time. I think it was mid 2000s. But at any rate, India is in this condition now. It's respected as a global power. It's the world's most populous country. It has good traditions of diplomatic ties with Iran and Israel and Palestinians and Arabs. So it could and should play a bigger role in the region. I think one of the worst things about the Middle East conflict has been the United States has been effectively supporting Israel endlessly, and not enough people are there to balance that out by supporting Palestinians. And India as an outside, so outside powers can play a positive role there, and I certainly think India can play a positive role there because what does India want? What is in Indian national interest? The same thing: de-escalation, priority of economic development. And there's all these trade routes of which India is a part, right? Um, it behooves for it to be interested in de-escalation in the region. And also lessening of sanctions on Iran is good news for India because Iran and India, even though we're not direct neighbors anymore, but there's a lot of ties between us. As you know, the port of Chabahar in southeastern Iran, for example, is supposed to be a place where India can invest and can it was supposed to be kind of a rival to Gwadar in Pakistan. Now Iran is happy to develop that relationship in India in Chabahar, but because of the sanctions, it's increasingly difficult. So Indian companies are not able to operate easily in Chabahar without without finding themselves in violation of the U.S. imposed and sort of global sanctions. So it's in India's interest for Iran to have less conflict with the West, which and de-escalation in the region can play an important role in that. So this is something that India can definitely do.
No, that is very important because India needs to, and India has the capacity to give a different change to the entire context of Global South, because Global South has always been seen with a jaundiced Oriental point of view. And for India, be it the I2U2, IMEC, be it the Haifa port that Adani has invested in Israel, on one hand, or the humanitarian affair that India has been doing in Palestinian territories for years now, along with the diaspora of so many Indians who have gone to work from Punjab and Haryana, who have gone to work in Israel earlier this year when the Thai and Filipino migrants left after the genocidal war started. At the same time, with Iran, India has, it's trying to talk about circumnavigating the sanctions to have a rupee based oil trade with Iran, because the quality of Iranian oil was way better than Iraqi or Saudi oil. And over the period of time after Manmohan Singh's government, there has been a decrease, and even during his government, of how much oil we used to take. But because of the sanctions and the pressures and the kind of, this tutelage that we have been forced to follow by US, it's again with us or against us kind of idea that is now with so much of conspiracy about now evolving about 9/11 also, but I don't know that what exactly are the impact of it for. But India has to, with Iran, it has something which is not just limited to the relationship, is not just limited to the Mughal dynasty. It goes way back in the BC to the spice route. And the Persian language has played an important role in how India linguistically as a term has developed. So it's
That's right.
cultural, it's people to people, the diaspora of it. So all of that. Now, Shrishti, another volunteer, is asking a very interesting question. She's asking that is Iran ready to take or give refuge to Palestinians or refugees coming from Palestine or West Bank side?
If Iran can accept the refugees, I mean, there has actually been a small number of people from Gaza who came to Iran, I think, for some sort of a government meeting. But there's not a lot of, I don't think Iran would be a destination they want to go. Uh, I don't think they will have much interest in that. Sure, I mean, Iran might give some sort of availability. But unfortunately, in Iran now there is a very big anti-refugee sentiment against the Afghans. For example, millions of Afghans in Iran. There's a huge racist anti-migrant sentiment in Iran, unfortunately. So it's not exactly sort of poised for more migration. But